All right. Well, hello to all of you. Welcome to I'm sitting at my dining table, my dining room table. I've got my coffee right behind me. It's late in the evening, but I'm making videos for the best students in the world, right? And so, what I want to talk to you about today is the set of slides that are labeled 10.4. So, you should have gone to Google Classroom and opened these up. And let's get ready to move through some of these. I'm going to set a timer. I know that this is a chapel day, so I'm going to try to keep this within about 32, 33 minutes. We'll see how far we can get with this material today. Enjoying a hot cup of coffee. And I don't know here, maybe you can see that. Maybe you can see that. It's got an inscription on the front of it that says Philippians 1:3. I know that looks like Phil, but that's short for Philippians. Philippians 1:3 says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. And the reason why this is a special cup to me is one of my pastor friends who lives in Mississippi made this cup for me. He is a potter. So that's what he does on the side. He makes pottery. He makes one gorgeous pottery. It's called fingerprint pottery. I won't go into all the reasons why, but fingerprint pottery. You can ask me later if you're really interested. But he made this cup for me a few years ago. I like to drink out of it because it reminds me of him. And the verse, which says, "I thank God upon every remembrance of you." And we should feel that way about one another, shouldn't we? All right, here we go. So we're talking about the emergence of nation states, and notice this first statement: nation states developed in the late Middle Ages as people in certain regions became more fully aware of their common traditions and language. I'll let you fill that in: nation states, then the word regions, and then traditions and language. And so I was having supper tonight with a friend of mine before I came home to finish recording these lessons while I'm gone. And he said, "So what do you got to do?" I said, "Well, I got to do a lecture about the emergence of nation states." "What's that about?" I said, "Well, toward the end of the Middle Ages, feudalism was in the rearview mirror, and people were starting to see themselves as a group. They were starting to see themselves as a group with common things, like, for instance, common traditions, as you see here in common language. And another thing that helped to draw them together was a common ruler or a common king." So this awareness of common traditions and common languages amongst people, this awareness became the foundation for what we sometimes call nationalism. Nationalism. So if you think about the title of this, The Emergence of Nation States, more and more the places that we've been talking about, like France and England, more and more they're going to see themselves not as loose knit regions that owe obedience to a feudal king, F Feudal, as in feudalism, but instead they're going to be seeing themselves as a people with, like the French will see themselves as the French people, the English as the English people. There'll be sort of a pride in being French or a pride in being um, um, English or German or whatever, although Germany really doesn't become Germany's not going to be a thing for a while. And I know I've told y'all that. Let's go on. Here we go. So, accompanying the growth of nation states was the rise of national monarchies. So, whereas early on, when we were talking about kings, kings were kings because nobles made them kings. But now that's changing as you work through the late Middle Ages. Kings are going to be kings by, some of them think, by divine right. And some are going to be kings by inheritance. not because nobility put them there, but because some of them are going to be convinced that they are kings because God put them there. And in a sense, if you know Romans 13, you know that's true. If you know Daniel 4, you know that's true. That no one really comes to leadership, regardless of who they are, unless God in providence allows it to take place. We talked about providence early in the school year. God's behind God, promotions of the Lord, and even that would be promotion to a throne. Well, here we have then these nation states uh, identifying themselves as a people with a certain king. So the monarchy served as the symbol of national pride. The independent king ruling a group of people with common interests formed the basis of early nation states. So a king that doesn't have to answer to anybody, including the Pope. Yep, you're going to see more and more in some of these situations, kings breaking away from popes. Remember, early on in the Middle Ages, kings were kind of fearful of popes because of this power that they wielded. We're going to talk a little bit more about that again in tomorrow's edition of the slides. At least I think we'll get that far. But for right now, people with an independent king thinking as a nation. This is what we're talking about when we talk about nationalism. Royal power steadily increased in the 14th and 15th centuries while feudalism gradually declined. This is what I've been trying to get through to you, is that feudalism is in the rearview mirror. And instead, what you have now is you have a steady increase of royal authority, royal power. As differences among the various people in Europe became more distinct, boundaries between nation states began to solidify. Countries in Europe started to take shape. Now, there's still, even in the Middle Ages, if you looked at a map of the Middle Ages, even the late Middle Ages, and looked at a map of these various countries, they still look different then than they do now. But they're starting to take shape and look sort of like what they look like now when we see a modern day map. Of course, it's like I told you in geography last year. Geography books can't be printed quick enough to keep up with all the changes. Changes are going to happen. It's inevitable. There'll be more breakups of countries and there'll be more drawing of new lines. But still, in this time in the late Middle Ages, these countries are starting to look a little bit like what they look like on the map now. By 1500, the major states of Europe were established. Now, Germany might have something to say about that. Italy might have something to say about that. But by 1500, France was considered its own nation. England, its own nation. Spain, its own nation. The medieval age was passing, and the modern age was in hand. Now, I know that's hard for you to think of in those terms. Modern age, we're talking 1500, Pastor. Don't they know that modern age is the 21st century? Yeah, but in the overall scope of history, we considered the modern age in which we live to have really begun right around the 1500s, the beginning of the 1500s, especially two events that are going to take place during that time: the rise of the Renaissance and then the Protestant Reformation. It's going to set a whole new course for Western history. All right, let's move on. So the war between England and France, yeah, they're still fighting with one another. And so we need to talk about that a little bit here. So we start with this. During the 14th and 15th centuries, England and France became embroiled in a long struggle known as the 100 Years' War. You type, I'm going to drink my coffee. Intermittent battles. Now, I was in a discussion with one of you, you know who you are, the other day about the difference between a war and battles. Wars are extended periods of time in which you have different battles take place. For example, you study the Civil War. The Civil War lasted, I'm talking about the American Civil War, lasted from 1861 to 1865. But from 1861 to 1865, there were lots of battles that were fought between the Union and the Confederacy. So you'll have battles in the South, battles like Shiloh, which is in Tennessee, battles like Fredericksburg, which is in Mississippi on the Mississippi River. And at the same time, you would have battles in places like Antietam, which is in Maryland, and one of the most famous ones, Gettysburg, which is in Pennsylvania. So these are various battles that take place within a war. In the Civil War, they didn't go out and fight every day. Okay, there were intermittent battles. Well, the same thing's true here with this 100 Years' War. In fact, some of you are probably already doing the map and go, wait a minute, Pastor, 1337 to 1453. Well, that's more than 100 years. Yeah, it is. And you know how good historians are at naming things. And so they just determined to call this 100 Years' War. Lasted longer than that. So you can see there were intermittent battles and then broken truces through this long extended period of time. So on and off again was the fighting during this. Okay, I'm going to have to get rid of my picture so you can see this. Sorry. Here we go. What began as a conflict between feudal lords, and namely what we're talking about here is the King of England and the King of France. Okay. What began as a conflict between feudal lords ended as a rivalry between two emerging nation states. At the beginning, it was all about the King of England trying to gain back territory in France that he had lost. Now, I don't have time to rehearse all that again. You should remember by now something of the story, how English kings held property in France. That had been true ever since the Norman invasion. And maybe you'll remember that King John lost a lot of territory in France to Philip II. King John was the King of England, Philip II, the King of France. And the English kings never were happy about that. They wanted to get it back. And so that is going to initiate this century plus long struggle between these two nations. All right, here we go. Next. Causes of the 100 Years' War. Number one, English holdings in France. That's still a problem. For the French, the English still hold too much in France. For the English, they want back what they'd lost, and they felt like it was worth fighting over. All right, so that's one of the problems. Another problem, the French monarch attempted to take control of Flanders. Okay, now I told y'all a few days ago this was going to be important that you remember where Flanders is located. It's located in northern France and southern Belgium, what today is northern France and southern Belgium. And remember, I told you how important Flanders was to the English economy, because the people in Flanders, the Flemish, they made fine cloth and they used English wool to do it. When the French monarch tried to take control of Flanders, this threatened England's lucrative, that means wealthy or money-making wool trade. Last of all is this, the last of the Capetians died. Now you got to go back to Hugh Capet. We talked about a lot of descendants that came from Hugh Capet. Philip II, Philip IV, the Fair of France. He was a Capetian. Anyway, the last of the Capetians died without an heir. And the English king, Edward III, was a distant relative, and he claimed the French throne was his. Hey, we heard something like this before. Oh, yeah. Long before Edward the Confessor, back in 1066, he died. And a fellow named William of Normandy claimed that the throne in England was his. Well, now we got the reverse. We got a king in England named Edward III who claims that he has a right to the throne of France since he is a distant relative. And just like in 1066, when the English nobles were unwilling to give the throne to William of Normandy, now you got French nobles that are unwilling to give the throne of France to Edward III. So it's a lot in common, even though it's about 300 years later, 300 or 400 years later. Well, England invades France, and to do war and to try to gain back lost territory and to try to take the throne, the French throne, for Edward III. And the English experienced some early victories at Crécy and Poitiers, and I hope I said that right, Agincourt. Pretty sure I'm right on that one. There's a guy, what's his name? He does a lot of the European history videos for AP Euro History. And he says, remember, students, it's a written test, not an audible test. And so what he means by that is you don't have to be able to pronounce these words. You just got to be able to write them out and spell them. And I'm kind of that way when it comes to some of these, well, many of these French terms. The point to get here is that the English experienced some early victories. This last one, Agincourt, it really was a wipeout on the part of the English. They gave the French a beat down, and I'm talking about hundreds of French soldiers lie dead on the battlefield. And it's because of these weapons right here, this development of a weapon called the longbow. The English mastered the use of these longbows. Now, I'm going to show this video, but let me kind of get you ready for the video. The whole idea is that the French were used to fighting at close range, and if they did use a weapon that projected something, they would use like a crossbow. But the crossbow had a limited range and it had limited impact. But these longbows, the bows, you can look at the picture and tell these bows were about as tall as the men that fired them. And I think it took about 120 pounds of pressure to pull back these strings. Now, guys, when I was up in Maryland a couple of weeks ago, I did something for the first time in my life. I shot a bow and arrow. I'd never done that before. And so the person put the bow in my hand and they said, "This is a 20-pound string, Pastor Williams." Well, I was able to pull that back. It really wasn't that difficult. So I'm trying to imagine, okay, a 20-pound string. I had to give a little bit of effort, but not much. What would a 120-pound string be like to pull back? And by 120 pounds, we don't mean the string weighed 120 pounds. We mean that's the type of force it would take to pull that string back and put that arrow in position. And you can imagine at 120 pounds how far this arrow is going to fly and the impact it is going to have when it hits its target. Okay, so here we go. Whoops, got to go back. Sorry. Click on the picture. Here we go.
The medieval longbow, made of yew wood, almost 6 feet long. It took about 140 pounds of force to pull the bow.
140 pounds.
August 26th, 1346. Crécy, a small town near the Norman coast of France. The forces of England's King Edward III faced those of his French antagonist, Philip VI. It was the first major clash of the 100 Years' War, pitting England against France. They fight over French mainland territory and the rule of France. England even claims the French throne.
And of course, I've already pointed out all that, so that just reinforces what I've been telling you.
On paper, Philip's troops are clearly superior.
And remember, Philip is the French king.
30,000 French warriors far outnumber 14,000 Englishmen. But the French have overestimated their chances of victory. During the battle, thousands of English arrows rained down on them. Some historians estimate that King Edward's men shot up to 35,000 arrows a minute. On the battlefield, a well-trained medieval archer has one tactical task: to break through the closed ranks of the enemy with targeted long-range shots.
The longbow is not a precision instrument. It's not designed to hit a single man at long range. It's designed to engage a large body of men, and almost certainly horses as well, moving towards the longbowman, and they will fire volleys of arrows at the great mass of the enemy. So it's about a very large amount of fire. So it's quite modern.
The longbow, a decisive weapon in late medieval battles. After years of training, the English archers had a weapon to defeat the French knights.
All right. So, if that's the case, then surely, sorry guys. Here we go. Now, so if that's the case, then surely the English are going to win this war, right? I mean, there's no way that the French are going to be able to overcome this. Well, into the story walks this young lady, and her name is Joan of Arc. I'm sure you've heard some stories of Joan of Arc. Notice this: France began to win, even though England had these longbows, and the English were beginning to win, some strategic battles. France began to win with a surge of nationalism, inspired by a simple peasant girl named Joan of Arc. Joan claimed that she had directly heard voices from heaven, and these voices directed her to drive the English out of France. Now, we're talking about a young lady, I believe, early to mid-teens, if I'm not mistaken. So we're talking about a young lady that would be about your age. Well, she claims to hear these voices from God, so she requests an audience with the French king. She convinces the French king that she has heard from God and that it is time to stand up against English tyranny and throw off the bands of English attacks, throw it off and win, defeat the French. So she rallied the dispirited French troops and accompanied them into battle. She actually led them into battle. She didn't just go see the king and say, I've gotten a word from the Lord. This is what you're supposed to do. She put on armor, and she herself led troops into battle and won some very important victories. Later, she was captured by the English and put on trial, and was found basically guilty of being a witch. That's basically what they found her guilty of. And she was burned at the stake in 1431. But instead of this, discouraging the French, her example stirred the French army to achieve even more victories over the English. So as a result of the rising nationalism amongst the French eventually were able to defeat the English in this 100 Years' War. Now, we're leaving a lot out. Books have been written about the 100 Years' War, and here I am telling you about it in the course of 4 or 5 slides. So there's so much more that you could learn and study about the 100 Years' War, but just suffice it to say at this point that the French were successful in defeating the English. So what are the consequences of the war for France now that France has won? Well, first of all, during the war, the Estates General, now go ahead and fill this in, then I'll explain. The Estates General allowed the French king to levy a royal land tax called Italie. Now, the Estates General, what is that? That is the name of the French Assembly. Just like Parliament is the name of the English Assembly, the Estates General was the name of the French Assembly. Well, this French Assembly allowed the French king to levy a royal land tax. He needed to raise money to fight the war, and this is how he did it. Well, because of the success over the English, the Estates General basically handed more authority over to the king. So his power over the French people increased significantly as a result of winning the war. The French king then began to raise money without the consent of the Estates General. There was no check on this growing power that he had. Okay, as you type that in, you should be remembering some things that we've said about English kings. So somebody can say it out loud. How is it that what did English kings have to gain in order to pass taxes to the people or on the people? And you should have said the consent of Parliament. And then I remember we have learned this, that Parliament had a particular kind of power when it came to taxation, and that is called the power of the purse, the power of the purse. Well, look at the difference right here, ladies and gentlemen. English kings had to get permission from Parliament. French kings did not have to get permission from the Estates General. So you can see two monarchies going in two different directions here. There was absolutely no check upon the power of the French king. And folks, that is going to lead eventually to absolutist kings in France. Meaning what? As an absolutist king, they can do what they want to do. Whereas in England, you don't get away with that kind of thing. So you're going to see that that's going to become even more evident as we get further into European history. Well, what about the consequences of the war for the people in England? Well, first of all, English kings began to concentrate on matters at home. I mean, might as well. They've lost to the French. They have lost practically all their holdings on the continent now. So it was time for them to turn their attention toward their island nation and try to make England great, just as the French king was making France great. So these English kings began to build a strong nation state of their own. So after the 100 Years' War, there's another war that takes place, but this is not a war between the English and the French. But this is rather a war that takes place between two rival royal families. And this is going to determine who should be the King of England. Now, this is called the War of the Roses, and here are the basics. It lasted about 30 years. The rival houses were the House of York versus the House of Lancaster. York was symbolized by a white rose, and Lancaster had as its symbol a red rose. This was before the war ever happened. And so, because of the two roses that were symbols for each family, historians have just called it the War of the Roses. Henry VII, who was of the House of Lancaster, eventually took the throne. He eventually wins out. Again, there's a lot we could talk about in this war, but this is just a survey type course. So if you're interested in War of the Roses, you will have to go and investigate that on your own. The thing you need to remember here is that the Lancaster house wins this war, and Henry VII is the one who becomes the new King of England. And as the new King of England, he establishes a new dynasty that we call the Tudor dynasty. His last name was actually Henry Tudor, but he was of a much larger family group known as the Lancaster House. So this is the beginning of that famous Tudor dynasty, which is going to feature Henry VII's son, whom I'm sure you've heard of, Henry VIII. And he's going to have 3 children, Edward VI, who's going to reign but a short time, and then Henry VIII's first daughter, Mary, who we know as Bloody Mary, is going to rule, and then finally Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. So we're getting close probably to some names that you may recognize. I hope you do. And if not, we'll have fun learning about them. Okay, we're going to stop right there. And so what we'll do is pick up with this slide tomorrow in the next set of slides, or in the next lecture, I should say. In fact, what we'll do in the next lecture is we'll finish the set of slides that you're doing right now, and we'll jump into 10.5 and talk a little bit more about the strength of medieval popes and the decline of medieval popes. All right, guys, thanks a lot for cooperating with me and with the substitute. We both appreciate it. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it back over to the substitute.